Last time I did this, I was in a more casual outfit. And what I said, while I would say it certainly still holds, was rather idealistic venting. Which is not what I will be doing today. Because the truth is, we are kind of fucked. We live in a world that is increasingly divided, with people increasingly divided, who are members of a class that is increasingly divided along ideological lines. And for the most part, ideological lines that do not serve them. Every day, it seems more and more likely that we are on the brink of war. And already, we have many people taking sides. Of course, usually with whatever side they think that their country is most likely to be on geopolitically. For example, here in Australia, you have many people clamouring for the United States of America, which has become, at this point, a fascist regime. But more problematic than that is that we have people calling themselves socialists, calling themselves communists, who will still go out of their way to claim that regimes such as that in China is their side, because they're socialist, apparently. Even though they have not been anything resembling socialism since the 1980s. And probably even more concerning is that such people who claim to be communists, which I do believe that they do think they are communists, I'm not going to deny that. But defending another regime that is committing a genocide. Obviously, I am not referring to Israel. I am referring to China against the Uyghur population. Then there is, of course, the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, which is an absolute travesty. And thankfully, those people who will support China are at the very least understanding which side of history is the right one to be on with respect to Israel and Palestine. And the same applies to the Saudi genocide in Yemen. But I don't want to dwell on genocides. I don't want to get all depressing about this. Last time I did this, the sun was rising. It is currently setting. There are those who will refer to conspiracy theories. You know, people who might be called far right. Some might call them fascists, which, while not being entirely unreasonable in any sense, particularly given the leadership, the administration, the kind of policies that these people are putting their weight behind. Policies that do not benefit them in any other way than perhaps ideologically. They hate this group or that group, and they want to see them suffer. But materially, do they benefit? No. No. Doesn't bring prices down. Doesn't bring prices down. Doesn't bring wages up. Doesn't do any of that. It doesn't give them more right to unionize, to fight back against their exploiters, who are the real enemy. All the ideology which they have taken up, all that ideology benefits when all is said and done is their exploiters. So, why? Why do they hold on to that? Why do so many working class people in the world, in the Western developed countries especially, why do they not understand what their interests are? Why do we have so many working class people embracing libertarian economics, or at the very least libertarian programs that they perhaps don't understand? Because those libertarian economics, all they will do is take the guardrails off. Take the guardrails off so they can be exploited more and more and more. Of course, this comes from a simple misunderstanding of how basic economics works, let alone the more in-depth and sophisticated kind of economics that was proposed by individuals such as Karl Marx. Why do so many people hold on to this? Well, it certainly doesn't help that we have poser regimes claiming to be socialist, claiming to be communist, while one, not being so, and two, committing atrocities in the name of the ideology which they take on as gospel while contradicting every minute of every day. That doesn't help. And I'm not just talking about China. That includes the Soviet Union. And I'll have people tell me, both critics of socialism, as well as people who support those regimes, saying, oh, this is purity fetishism. You know, why are you just saying that, oh, socialism has never happened? And it's simple. It hasn't. What has happened, what has been given rise to, is an authoritarian perversion. There was a time when I was a Marxist-Leninist. There was a time when I believed that countries like China, like Cuba, like North Korea, were the future. And at least in the case of China, they will be the next preeminent superpower. That at this point is undeniable. The scientific progress that they are making, the technological progress that they are making, is absolutely stunning. The comeback of the Chinese civilization has been a sight to behold. And much of their now technological developments open the door to precisely the kind of fully automated luxury communism that many would dream of. But that does not make them socialist. That is the crucial point. They are an authoritarian party state with a state-guided capitalist economy. That is not socialism. That is not communism. And of course, you have this whole ideological framework, Dengism, suggesting, oh, this is just a transition. We have to reform and open up in order to let the productive forces develop, and then eventually we can reach socialism. That's not how this works. For one, you don't get to socialism in the first place by going back into capitalism. You don't do that. It's not how that works. The Chinese Communist Party just created a new capitalist class. They just created a Chinese capitalist class. And that class is not going to give up their power. They will not give up their economic power. At least not without a fight. I.e., class war, a new revolution. But unfortunately, a lot of people in China buy that. A lot of Chinese working class people buy into the myth. And I can't do much as an Australian. I will leave that to groups like Chuang. Or Chuang. Not sure how to pronounce that. I don't speak Chinese. But what I want to do is outline to anyone who is watching, who has perhaps bought into right-wing conspiracy theories. And I'm not talking about pseudoscience. I am talking about things regarding politics, government, economics, all that stuff. Now, I want to start with the World Economic Forum. I'll include a link to a video in the description that will outline the role that the World Economic Forum serves in capitalist society and institutions like it. The World Economic Forum is a monster of international finance capital. That is what it is. It is the manifestation of capital's tendency to consolidate, to monopolize, to spread itself across lands, across borders, across oceans, like a plague. Multinational corporations exploiting everything and everyone that they can. This I refer to as bourgeois globalism. Of course, bourgeois referring to bourgeoisie, which is the Marxist terminology for the capitalist class. And I am not 100% certain how much of the Great Reset conspiracy theory is actually true, whereas how much of it is false. There are some things that are most certainly false. First things first, whatever the World Economic Forum has in mind, whatever collaboration is going on with the United Nations, that is not socialism either. I see people saying, oh, Australia is a socialist country. No, we're not. No, we are not. That is the biggest, most blatant lie I've ever heard. But the people who say this obviously define socialism with the absolutely bullshit definition that doesn't make any sense, doesn't hold up to scrutiny, that socialism is when the government does stuff. Although some people will also just conflate socialism with authoritarianism. Which, if we're looking to something like the Soviet Union as a model for socialism, is entirely understandable. If we are looking at China as a model for socialism, entirely understandable. But the fact is, again, those countries, not socialist, never were. There was an attempt to transition, perhaps, in China. It was sabotaged. There was an attempt to transition in Russia. It was sabotaged. Mainly because they used a state but I won't get ahead of myself there. So the World Economic Forum, whatever great reset thing they have planned, whatever Agenda 2030 is going on with the United Nations, I haven't looked into it yet, but it is not socialism, I can tell you that right now. Now, another claim that the government is full of people who fiddle with minors. Now, some people might be aware that I'm referring to QAnon. Now, I'm not going to lie. The whole situation with stuff like Jeffrey Epstein, the amount of people in the US government who will be complicated, who are complicit in that, certainly puts fuel to the fire and gives credence to the claims. For the US at least. I am not sure about any other country. So, but where we start to get into extreme territory is when we start adding adjectives like satanic or Jewish. That is when we start getting into dangerous territory. Now, I also had a reply on X from someone who was definitely a QAnon fanatic. Their profile name was literally Bill Gates whack kids. Trying to tell me that socialism or communism is quote unquote economic Satanism. Now, in light of research that I have done, in terms of reading I have done recently, I can say with confidence, I can already say this first bit with confidence, communism is not economic Satanism. But I can also say with confidence that in fact, communism is economic Christianity. Now, any Christian who likely just heard me say that is probably going up in arms right now. They're going, what the hell do you mean communism is economic Christianity? It's like blasphemy, whatever. Let me explain. Now, there are some passages in the book of Acts, at the end of Acts 2 and at the end of Acts 4. I cannot recite them off the top of my head. But they are precisely an indicator of the kind of communism that I'm talking about. And people say, oh, that was just charity. Christians today say that was just charity. It was entirely voluntary. And kinda. It's not like anyone was forcing them to sell their things. No one was forcing them to sell their things. However, the understanding of freedom at the time, it was different to the way in which we understand it today. Freedom back then meant to do good. If you were not doing good, then you were not acting freely. That is one immediate fallacy that people today make when they try to say it was voluntary. In their minds, it wasn't. Not at all. Because if they did not do it, then they were not acting freely. I will move somewhere else. Some people are coming. That's all good now. So one might say, oh, in an abstract sense, they were still acting freely in a real sense, the way we understand it today. And the ideological or the understanding, the semantics mean nothing. And on that abstract level of the fact that, yes, they were not being literally physically coerced to sell their things. They were not being physically coerced to participate in these communities. When I say communities, I almost literally mean communes. Because while they did predominantly make their way by wealthy converts selling all their things, there was some production for subsistence. And that is a hint that casts some doubt upon the notion that early Christian communism was only a communism of distribution. It was mainly a communism of distribution. But it wasn't not a communism of production, if that makes sense. The early Christians lived in communities where they felt religiously compelled to participate. We have early Christian texts, such as the Didache, also known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. It was not written by the apostles, or at least that is not the belief by scholars. However, it was written as early as the late 1st century. That book almost made it into the canon. But to be overly reductive, the reason it didn't was not just because they couldn't confirm apostolic authorship, but also because it was just irrelevant by the 4th century. Because by the 4th century, this early Christian communism had completely evaporated as Christianity became the religion of the very empire it sought to destroy. And some Christians might object to me saying destroy. But if we can understand a few facts on the ground here, that Christianity at first was predominantly a lower class movement among Jews in Judea. More people coming. I am on public property. I cannot be too concerned with telling people to go away. So yeah, Christianity was a lower class movement in Roman Judea. Now, what did these early Christians most likely believe? Particularly the Jewish Christians, because they were the first. Firstly, that Jesus was going to come back within their lifetime. Did that happen? Obviously not. But that is what they believed. Another belief regarding the communities that they were building was that what they were building another thing they believed about the communities they were building is that what they were building was the nucleus of the coming kingdom, which would, of course, be established upon Jesus' return. Now, if one understands what the idea among Jews of the Messiah was at the time, one would understand that the kingdom of God that was to be created was not some heavenly kingdom up in the clouds or in another, I don't know, plane of reality or something. It was an earthly kingdom. And what that meant was overthrowing Rome. Now, obviously, when Jesus was crucified, in any other set of circumstances, he would have been called a false Messiah, and the Jewish people would have moved on. But something happened. And all of a sudden, within a week, Jesus' disciples were going around saying that he had been risen from the dead. And that he was going to come back. That he was going to come back within their lifetimes and establish the kingdom on earth, which meant overthrowing Rome. Now, the communities they built, the way I see it, it is almost a striking similarity to the anarchist idea of prefiguration, of building a new society in the shell of the old, of building the new kingdom that they expected in the shell of the society which existed, the Roman Empire. And these communities sprouted all over the Roman Empire as the religion spread. Of course, such figures as St. Paul were predominantly responsible for Gentile converts, and the universalization of the faith. Although one might argue that Jesus' own teachings did indicate a form of universalism that expanded beyond just the Jewish people. Now, obviously, when I say, oh, this is prefiguration, obviously that requires an asterisk with the added religious vector, which is that they were anticipating a revolution, but to be led by someone who, from an atheist perspective, was dead. But I don't think that really changes the intent. They believed a revolution was coming, and they were building it on the ground. And not only that, that revolution resembled something akin to modern anarchist communism. That's pretty insane when you think about it. One might explain that all that meant was lower classes rising up, and then something else happened. His followers thought he had risen from the dead, but he hadn't, you know. Personally, I think maybe he did. And as such, I think that prefiguration needs to be renewed. How do we build a new society in the shell of the old? There are many methods: trade union struggles, mutual aid, venture communism, an idea around building worker cooperatives in a capitalist society with the aim of changing the economic conditions. There are many approaches that one could take, or multiple approaches at once. I do think that is the best, a hybrid approach, and I think that a lot of anarchists would probably agree. Can't put our eggs in one basket. But to my fellow working class people, you are exploited every single day when you go to work. When that paycheck comes in, no matter how big that paycheck is, you are not getting your full value. Because if you were, your boss wouldn't be making a profit. And obviously, I'm not talking about your lower level manager. I'm talking about the guys in the boardroom, the CEO, people at the top. If your manager just makes a salary or a basic wage like you, he's a worker too. If you own a home, there's another prefiguration approach to consider. Housing syndicates. A step towards decommodification. In Australia especially, the situation with housing is very, very acute. I think sooner than we think, the housing bubble that has kept inflating and inflating for the last however long will pop. And it will bring the entire economy crashing down with it. At the very least, a word of warning. If you have a mortgage or a home loan, make sure you pay it off. Because if you pay it off, at least you will be more likely to be safe when that bubble pops. You might not lose your home and be impoverished. But decommodification is what really needs to be done. To stop treating housing and land, which by all accounts should be a basic human right. How possible is it to function without just a basic roof over your head? It is treated as a commodity to be bought and sold, speculated on the market. That's what causes crisis, not the immigrants. The immigrants haven't caused shit. To those who believe that, the immigrants have not caused the housing crisis. The immigrants have not caused the cost of living crisis. But let's say you really don't want the immigrants here. Let's say, oh, it's cultural stuff. Don't take it out on the immigrants. Because to answer this question, ask yourself this question. If you don't want the immigrants here, who brought them here? Why did they come here? And it's not just the government. Why did they come here? Where do they all come from? They all come from the third world, mostly. Why? What are their lives like in the third world? And even more so, if we are talking about Muslim immigrants and otherwise Arab immigrants from the Middle East. Why do they come here? War? Poverty? Perpetual exploitation? The answer is imperialism, which encompasses all of those things. That Western governments have spent so long exploiting these countries for everything they are worth, using their homes as battlefields for their wars over oil. But if you're a working class person, is not your fault. It's most likely not your fault. Because I'm sure that the vast majority of working class people are anti-war in principle. Because who benefits from war? Not you. Not the immigrants who are forced to come here when their houses are bombed, when their children are bombed, when their cities are carpet bombed for nothing but oil. For nothing but oil and resources. You don't benefit. They don't benefit. Who benefits from war? The capitalists. And then who benefits when immigrants come here? Especially undocumented. And they seek out work. And they have to take far lower pay because they don't have any other choice. Who benefits from that? Not you. Not them, certainly not them. The capitalists benefit from that. On another issue, climate change is real. Anyone who believes that it is not is denying science. Simple scientific fact. It has been spoken about for 50 years. Anthropogenic climate change is real. And the only people who benefit from saying that it isn't, from people believing that it isn't, is fossil fuel capitalists. Granted, might I concede that the transition to renewables is being done terribly? Yes. In fact, not nearly enough is being done in the first place, let alone it being done well. What is the solution to these problems? What is the solution to the cost of living crisis, most of which is not driven by inflation, but by price gouging on the part of capitalists? How do we solve these problems? How do we create a world where you and your children and your children's children and subsequent generations can be guaranteed a dignified life? A life where they don't need to make the choice between paying the rent, having a roof, or paying the grocery bill and having food on the table. Where the generations that come after us are not condemned to the fallout of climate change, with coastal cities going underwater, entire countries going underwater, with natural disasters being so much worse, and it just being too hot. How do we ensure all of those things? It is by becoming economic Christians, becoming communists, by following our class interest as working people across borders, because we are an international class, whether we like it or not. communism can only be a global system. So people who describe themselves as nationalists, who are scared of globalism, this is not that. This is the guarantee of a dignified life. The guarantee that your labour means something. That you are not alienated from what you produce. That life means something other than bare survival. Than just going to work for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, possibly even more than that. Just to put food on the table. Just to make sure you have a roof over your head. And the things that you produce, where does that go? Doesn't go towards your subsistence. The capitalist sells it and makes profit off it. There's value you produced. People may still have objections. But at this point, what other choice do we have? It's either going to be communism or extinction. We have to make that choice. We have to make it now. What choice are you making?